Welcome, everyone, to another Voices with Vervaeke. I'm here with somebody who's been here before, Kasra Mirzaie, and we had an amazing conversation. This is part of a series of ongoing conversations I'm having that often get into dialogos on IFS and related topics around ally work and parts work and the dialogical nature of the self. I've recorded one recently with Paul van der Klee on just this topic. It'll come out shortly. Recorded one with Mark Lewis, which will come out. So I've been diving very deeply in all of this. So first of all, Kasra, great to have you back. Why don't you just tell us again a little bit about yourself, your credentials and how your work and my work are connected in your mind and things like that. Very good to have you back. It was a great pleasure talking with you last time.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be back and to talk with you again. So yeah, I'm Kasra Mirzaie. You introduced me. I'm a clinical researcher. I'm a psychotherapist, and I'm also a teacher at a university. So I'm doing this kind of three things: teaching, researching, and treating, like doing psychotherapy. And basically, I have a very broad spectrum of interests in my work. So it's, on the one hand, it's IFS related. By training, I'm a behavioral therapist, and I do combine certain things. I work especially with adolescents and adolescent residential crisis center, where I'm working with heavily impaired adolescents from 14 to 18 that have personality disorders, severely traumatized. At the same time, I'm also doing research on affect dynamics, it's called, and it's basically it's the psychological research of self-organized criticality, I would say. So it's
wow.
Wow, so what I'm looking at is how emotions and affect, how they fluctuate, and how the tipping point comes probably during therapy. It can be during therapy, where things shift, where a phase transition takes place. And I'm looking at this from a more technical perspective, a dynamical systems theoretical perspective. So that's the technical part of my work. And yeah, besides that, I'm deeply, deeply interested in the question of meaning, basically. And this has drawn me to your work, John. I've been an avid follower of your work for many years now. And yeah, it's a pleasure to talk to you. So yeah, I'm this topics of meaning and spirituality and how science and spirituality can be conjoined again. That's deeply, deeply relevant to me.
All right, let's talk about this. And I'm going to talk to you about self-organizing criticality too, because I've been doing some recent stuff on that. But let's start with the IFS, and there's a couple questions that come to mind. We sort of left off last time, and you brought this up when we were off camera, with a question that I really wrestled with, both with Mark Lewis and with Paul van der Klee, and feel free to sort of fumble your way around, because they were too, and that's not an insult to them. That's not an insult to them. Like there was this like this is a hard question, and I'm gonna there's two questions. One is the question of self-deception with IFS, and the other is the question of self-deception in IFS. Okay, so there's the one is, can people use IFS to significantly deceive themselves, bullshit themselves? There's a new paper out that ChatGPT-4 is basically not lying, it's doing bullshitting, where it's making things salient and indifferent to the truth, and making us very prone to that, and it's very dangerous already. And so there's that question about self-deception that way, but also, can the parts deceive us? That's self-deception in IFS. Can they deceive us? Can they lie to us if they have some intentionality, and if they have goals which are sometimes orthogonal or perhaps even opposite of ours? Could they deceive and lie to us? And then that brings up the question that is lurking in the background of a lot of religious people's thinking when they confront IFS, which is the possibility of evil in all of this. And then that will, I think if we get into that in the right way, that we can shade into the second topic, which is IFS and spirituality and things
Yes.
like that. But let's start with the first one. So what about, self-deception with IFS? And then we'll move into self-deception in
Yeah.
IFS.
If I'm not mistaken, it was even the last question you asked me in the last conversation that we had.
Yes.
And now I really had time to really
Good.
to really sit with the question, and I really contemplated on it and meditated on the question actually more deeply. And
well, first of all, thank you for doing that.
well, thank you for asking, because it really gripped me, the question. And I think it was interesting because I was a little bit blindsided by the question. And I don't mean this in any kind of, reproachful sense or, but because I had an implicit assumption and I projected, like how, John Vervaeke, the guy that gives courses and, dedicated parts of his entire career to this question, is asking me about self-deception. So I gave an initial answer, and I will, state my answer in a second. But if you allow, John, I want to first leave out the IFS bit and address self-deception more broadly and generally, and then we can circle back to it. If you
that totally fair. That's a Socratic move. Let's step back and make sure we're clear about our orientation.
Because I also, I really took this serious, and I really not only thought about it in an intellectual sense, I did practices on it, on how I can answer this. How can I address this question? How can I get into contact with this question? And
you're really whetting my appetite. You're really whetting my appetite for this.
Well, it was an IFS and, let's say, Jungian informed practice that I did there. So so the answer to it is also in the practice, I would say. And as I said, I was really thinking about it. And so again, to reiterate my initial answer from last time for the audience, part of my answer was that I think we really have to reconnect to our body, like deeply inhabit the body again in this Merleau-Ponty sense that you mentioned too. And I also mentioned that I think that communal feedback is really necessary, like social communal feedback. And I still think it's a good answer, but I was dissatisfied with it a little bit because I felt it's incomplete. There's something missing. And then it hit me when I, had my daydreamings and I, did my practices and all of that. And so first of all, I think this communal feedback is also something that ties back to what we talked about last time about Vygotsky and scaffolding, because IFS is something like an inner ecology of communal feedback. It's like when we take the outer family system or external family system serious, we build a scaffold to internalize these stuff. So I really think that, external feedback systems like the community, they are important for correction, right? For maybe not self-correction, but correction. And and it was interesting because I think the scaffolding part is important, and something that hit me is just the side note, John, is that the scaffold is important, but the goal is this internalization, because the goal is self-governing, to be self-governed. And interestingly enough, John, I realized recently that that's actually if I'm not mistaken, I mean, people can correct me in the comments if they're like, but if I'm not mistaken, that's also the root of the word God in Farsi, in Persian. It's like we say Khuda, and in Khuda, there is Khud, which means self. And the term means self-governing. So it's like this autopoetic thing of self-making, self-government. And this is a notion of God that I always found meaningful, even as a teenager and even as a kid. So that, just as a side note, I still think this.
That's a good one. I like that. So the idea that God is sort of fundamentally like autopoietic in that sense, not just self-ruling, but self-generative too. And I mean, I can see why that would appeal to somebody with deep experience and reflection on Jung
Yeah.
and also IFS, right? Because
Well,
I can see that.
and again, Neoplatonism and the philosophical Silk
Yeah,
Road, right? So it's
yeah,
deeply
yeah, yeah,
Sufi and mystic as well.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
and um, so that was one thing that it came to my mind. It's that it's about this self-government and
So, if you'll allow me, that's already you're doing. Just to put a pin in it for
yeah,
foreshadowing purposes. I mean, you're already bringing a spiritual dimension to this, because this is a way of like being God-like in the virtuous sense of the word,
yes,
being like God, participating in God's nature, not just representing and thinking
yes,
about it, but enacting what God is fundamentally in some way. Is that a fair thing to say?
absolutely. And I think you're spot on when you say participate in it, because I
Yes,
think there is
yes.
this danger of again identifying with God, self being God, but I think it's really a
Yeah.
participation, setting up the inner ecology and the right constraints so that this spirit of intelligibility, this ultimate can
Mm-hmm.
unfold and help us. And ultimately that can be also the scaffold too, so that we can self-actualize, self-realize. So yeah, I understand God in that sense, at least from this perspective. And
Okay. Excellent.
so
So that's good to excellent. That's useful for where we're heading. But let's go back to what
yes,
what you
yes.
want to say about self-deception.
So I was sitting in after our conversation, I was sitting, I don't know where I went, but I was sitting in the train and I was observing people. And then I really thought about this question of self-deception. I really left out the IFS part because I wanted to understand self-deception first, the nature of self-deception. And if I'm not mistaken, and John, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think fundamentally it's the question about sinning. Would you agree on that?
Oh, so I
Like in
think
the sense of hamartia, like, missing the mark
yeah,
kind of thing.
missing mark. So well, let me respond, because I think this is an important distinction. I think there is self-deception,
Hmm.
and then I think there is a profound kind of self-deception that begins to progressively dehumanize us
Yeah.
and make us incapable of properly connecting to our humanity,
Hmm.
to our shared humanity, and to ultimate reality. And then when the self-deception becomes like that, right, then I think it takes on a kind of existential, psychological, ethical, and therefore spiritual profundity. And then I would call it sin. We become incapable in a deep way
Yeah.
of realizing how deeply the self-deception has
Yes.
become. So I don't want to say things like, when I deceive myself about thinking that there's enough food in the fridge. Is that a sin?
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
right,
Yes. I know. I understand.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I get what you
It's
mean.
I've made use of the confirmation bias or something like that. It's definitely self deception, but it's sin, because what you're doing is the self deception is making you miss the mark of connecting to your humanity, connecting to
Yes.
reality. That's how I would
Yes.
answer.
And that's how I was thinking about it. Not so much from this moral or ethical perspective, like reducing
Right?
sin to just a misdeed, but actually, so my view was that I could be wrong about this, but the image that I had in that moment was that it can be on a continuum from certain biases, like cognitive biases that we have, to
Yes, yes.
like really distorted views that really um, fuel misdeeds, or are the vehicle for these kind of things.
We are exactly on this. We are
Okay,
exactly on the
good.
same page about
So
this.
that to me is important because it's the fundament of my
Yeah.
argument, or what I was thinking about. And then when I was observing the people on the train, I realized, well, it's interesting because if we are all sinners, which we in a sense are, and me included, and those people in the train
Yes.
included, how come we can still relatively live in a peaceful manner? I mean, obviously,
Mm.
right now in parts of the world
Oh.
there isn't so much peace, and but to be fair, it's still we can still get along. Um, and why hasn't all hell broke loose? I was thinking.
Mm.
And I was wondering if there is any solution to this problem of self-deception at all. Because, and then I realized really that just how you say it, it's this perennial, it's an eternal, I would say, archetypal struggle that we really struggle with this. And then I thought, well, if there isn't a solution, maybe there can be a counterbalance, like a counter system that can at least balance this out. And then it hit me, and I thought, maybe the question could be, is there something more relevant than self-deception, or more pertinent than self-deception?
Okay, can I reply to both of those points? So yeah, I think the first, again, I think we're on the same page. I think I talked about this in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis.
Yeah.
When self-deception is like, it's that parasitic processing, and especially when it's moving towards sin, you need a very comprehensive counteractive, like dynamical system that can like counteract
path,
it.
Right?
Yeah, the Eightfold Path, exactly. And then that idea that you just said about we get to this state where we're sort of incapable of loving, which like I think of sin as a failure to love wisely, and so what happens is a lot of our primary abilities get hijacked, but we're not completely bereft of love.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, this is sort of a Buddhist Christian answer, a Zen answer, a Zen Neoplatonic answer, and reason is bound up with love. So I don't mean it in the modern sense. They're all bound up together, right? There's a possibility of loving our way into, agapically loving our way into a dharmic dynamical system that can counteract the parasitic processing and wake us up. That was sort of my response to both of the things you said. What do you think about that?
And actually, that was this big part of the answer I arrived at. It's like, if there is a panacea, then it's love. And I would add forgiveness, not only in the sense of I forgive you, but in this agapic sense of forgiving. So
yes,
to me,
very much.
That struck me like, well, that could be, if there is a panacea, then it's love. Well, obviously we have to differentiate between, how you love. And I think, the ability to love wisely is absolutely spot on. But I was thinking like, well, people do we deceive ourselves all the time, and we sin all the time, right? So I was thinking, well, what still helps us to keep the world in balance? And these are these small acts like, well, don't think about it. It doesn't matter. It's these small deeds of forgiveness and love that, to me, balance out this deception that can also, that too can, while I'm saying this, I also, again, imagined it being on this continuum from cognitive bias, to those really big misdeeds that maybe also need forgiveness at times. And I want to, you can respond to it.
Well, I was just going to say, and I think correspondingly, there's love and forgiveness on a continuum from a moment of somebody steps in front of your way to get on the bus, and you say, oh, don't worry about it, all the way up to the profound kind of agapic forgiveness that could end a war.
Yes, exactly. So that to me was really important to ground me and to now think about the more technical matters. But I was thinking of, again, this, committing the act of sin and self-deception, and realizing that it can also be quite traumatic if you do so. If we realize that we haven't properly framed the world correctly, the world around us correctly, and also, and therefore the space, of agency and actions. And this can often result in remorse and guilt, right? So you realize, why did I do this?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm really feeling bad about this. And that, to me, this again necessitates at some point, if we talk about like real relationships, a real relation, also this counter act of forgiving and loving. So yeah.
I think that's right. I mean, Brandon, in his book on Hegel, talks about a spirit of trust, and how Hegel actually argues that we are the we that becomes an I that is part of the we, like, and that's absolutely ultimately dependent upon trust and forgiveness, acts of trust and forgiveness
Yes.
that give us the basic shared normativity so that reason can actually be at work in the world. And if you don't have all of that, reason has no purchase on people, and it just degenerates into sort of a mechanical and maniacal logical machinery, or it becomes this weird, twisted cleverness,
Exactly.
and things like that.
And that's exactly right, because I was thinking about people who are maybe really clever, really logical, maybe really successful. And I was thinking, well, I would choose someone with his heart in the right place over someone who's really smart, but is able to play those games. Anytime, any day, I would still choose this person, because to me that's like the basis. And you probably know this quote by Terence, like this: "I am human and nothing human is alien to me." So this to me is really a credo, like to really get to understand the person, and that's that's maybe the segue to the question of how IFS also can respond to it. But before I come to this, I wanted to add to my initial answer. I think the missing piece for me was the heart. Like, really, what helps to counteract or transcend self-deception is if things come from this place of from the heart, and it's having the heart in the right place to me that, well, if any practice that engages authentically in this kind of, let's call it agape, in this kind of, heart space, that practice to me can be deemed virtuous. And if IFS does so, then IFS too can help it.
That's a very good answer. So now, you may not be implying this, so let me ask you as a question. Is there the possibility of IFS being practiced not from that space and then being a mechanism by which people engage in very deep or even traumatic kind of self-deception? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. And I would be really skeptical and hesitant about statements that refute that. Because I've seen this. I've seen people, even in IFS, engage in this parts language that became the root of their self-deception, because ultimately it's some form of framing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And if you don't have a variety of practices, and whatever you want to call it, maybe beliefs, belief in a certain practice or whatever, then I think you can you can be trapped quicker than you think in it. So to me, I mean, I was trained. Now we can focus on IFS a little bit more. I was trained by Tom Holmes, who was a professor for clinical psychology, I think somewhere in Michigan. I forgot where. I know he lives in Kalamazoo, and he practices, I think, for like 30 or 40 years now, IFS, and he was, close friend. He is a close friend of Tom Holmes, but he kind of has this unique and individual take on IFS where he combines it with spirituality.
Oh, interesting.
Yes,
Interesting.
yes, and I was trained by Tom Holmes. Like, he's like, so maybe that's why to me they go hand in hand so much together. And he calls it also even a path of the heart. He also has this book, John, that I can recommend to you. It's called, I think, IFS and Spirituality: A Path of the Heart.
IFS and Spirituality: Path of the Heart? I will look that up.
Yeah, and
thank you.
And it is his style is deeply inspired by his Christian upbringing, but at the same time, I think he was later also later from his his path as a Sufi. So he got into the Sufi order.
Oh,
and it's really interesting.
Wow.
Yeah.
So the Neoplatonism is quite strong in
exactly.
him. I sound like somebody talking about the Force.
Yes, absolutely.
The Neoplatonism is strong with him.
Absolutely. So yeah, please go on.
Keep going. Oh, well, I just wanted to ask. So for you, there was the training that, the proper way to do IFS is from a spiritual orientation, where spirituality means having this wise heart
Yes.
that is orienting you and acting as a sort of deeper conscience on anything you're doing. Is that a fair way to talk about
and
it?
I think because anything, to me, I experienced that if these things come from the heart, they are life promoting, and they serve life in this Nietzschean sense.
So I want to slow down here, because I know what you're saying, but I know what a lot of people can hear when they hear come from the heart. They just mean a deep impulse or something that they really like, right? And you're not saying that.
No.
You're talking about something very different. You're talking about agape, and you're talking about an orientation to forgiveness in both senses of the word. And you're talking about trying to be wisely connected to yourself, embodied, as you said last time, to other people. Also listen to the community and be open to correction. I want to make sure that that's what you are talking about. Is that correct?
Thank you for clarifying this again. It's implicit, and it makes sense for the audience to clarify it again. That's exactly right. I'm not talking about the heart as this place where affective and emotional impulses come, right? So sometimes they can be part of it, but I think there is a simpler way, and you talk about it in your work, when you also even in your reference to Heidegger. It's about the caring. It's about caring.
Yeah, the caring that's just wrapped up with being a cognitive being.
Yes.
Right.
And that's why I was talking about life, things that promote life, things that promote existence and being, and they bring it also into being. So that's the place when I'm talking about. And one of the reasons why I like parts work, and before we talk about where it can, promote self-deception, is that it somehow restores our capacity for potential, John. It's like,
say more about that. That's really intriguing.
Yeah. So that was actually, I had this, I came to IFS from this Jungian background, and it always sounded right that we are, again, not the masters of our own houses, but there was also something relieving. There was a great relief in the fact that it's just a part. Well, I don't want to trivialize it, but what I'm saying is that it's an answer to our vices and deceptions. Actually, if there's a part of me that feels that way or did that way, there is always also the potential and capacity for different kind of things to change and to allow me to transform and to and I think parts work in that sense is really powerful, because it helps us to get out of this stuckness and fixation. Especially when it comes to, just want to add this last thing, John.
Please.
Especially when it comes to like these adjectival traits, like what we mean in personality, like the big five, etc. When I attribute these traits, like, I'm lazy, I'm unorganized. Just framing the language differently and saying, well, a part of me is lazy, part of me is unorganized, creates this potential, and I would say hope, for different kind of things, for variation. So I just want, sorry, I jumped in. No, please go ahead.
So, again, with the sort of the Neoplatonism of bringing Plato and Aristotle back into this discussion, where I think they should be, you got Plato's idea about, if I can get the right inner justice or harmony or musicality between my parts, then they all can come to the overall greatest fulfillment. And I can achieve a kind of profound inner peace, which liberates me from external self-deception, because my perception and attention and cognition are not being twisted and thwarted by all this salience, manipulation, and conflict inside. There's that. And then you took that and you said, in Aristotle's proposal, that what we can do is we can cultivate traits that compensate for our personality or constitutional deficits. I'm really introverted, so I'll cultivate the virtue of courage to compensate that.
To attain the golden
but
mean, right?
yes, the golden mean, exactly. And this idea that by doing that, I release all kinds of potential for the kind. Magnanimous. I can become the great souled person.
Yeah.
That's what the original meaning
Wow.
of Aristotle's term was, like the great souled person, the person of great anima, right? Not in the Jungian sense, in the Greek sense.
Yes.
So I think that's, I think that's glorious what you just said. I think that's a great connection.
Yeah. And wonderful. It's to connect, again, to these great thinkers like Aristotle and Plato. And maybe this is also, again, a place where we can dive a little bit more into this Neoplatonic, maybe Sufi kind of thinking, because, again, I came to the realization, John, and just to reiterate and to say it again, the missing piece to me was this heart kind of thing, in a sense of caring.
But in the Sufi sense of heart,
yes.
I can really hear the Sufism, the way of the heart, yes. Which is not the romantic, the way of emotion or impulse or, anything like that. Yeah.
It's the place to me from which the love to our embodiment, to our community, to our culture, to nature, and ultimately to the sacred comes from, and it emanates and also emerges from. And interestingly enough, John, recently, independently of this thought process, I realized later that that is really congruent with this Sufi kind of thinking, because in these mystic traditions, because they really view the heart as this nexus, right? The bridge between the spirit and the soul, between ruh and nafs. Nafas, what we call the psuke, the breath.
Yeah. And we still have that meaning of heart.
Yeah.
Even left in English language, we talk about getting to the heart of the matter.
Yes.
Right, where the thing that's holding it all together and keeping it alive, that very much too. Yes.
And also to add again to this layer, this dimension that you mentioned, which I think is spot on, is that even to the self and to reality, there are levels to it, there are layers to it, right? And this heart space as well, there are layers to it. And
and is that part of the potential too? So the idea that Plato has this idea, when I start to get the inner harmony, and I think IFS is about getting the inner harmony in a deep way. I start to see more deeply outwardly into reality, but I also like mirror back, reflect.
Yeah.
I also see more deeply into me than I could before, and that unlocks potential. And that gets, I get the meta virtue of Sophrosun. I get this ability to be more and more tempted by what's real and by what's good.
Absolutely. I create more inner peace, and that inner peace allows me to get, again, more into contact with reality, with different layers of reality. And that, again, affords my inner work and transformation.
Excellent.
And then we have this, not the reciprocal narrowing, but the opening and the anagogy that you talked about.
The reciprocal opening.
So I think that's really congruent to that. And so
I'm really looking forward to this IFS book, especially if it's bringing in these Sufi themes. Thank you for recommending it.
Yeah, he would also be a wonderful interlocutor. He's I really respect his work, and again, he's my teacher, and I learned a lot from him. And he's really open to these kind of things. And I think lots of the intellectual stuff that we talk about are often implicit in the work that they're doing, or that he does, in this sense. So yeah, and again, and to me, that's the bridge to your question about spirituality, because if it comes from this, if we learn the language of the heart in the sense that we're talking about, I think, automatically or naturally transcend this notion of sheer therapeutic method and technique. And to me, that's a naturalistic account of spirituality too.
Thank you for watching. This YouTube and podcast series is by the Vervaeke Foundation, which, in addition to supporting my work, also offers courses, practices, workshops, and other projects dedicated to responding to the meaning crisis. If you would like to support this work, please consider joining our Patreon. You can find the link in the show notes. So wait, this is also gold. Okay, I'm just going to put a couple of things to what you said with some of my language and see if this lands for you.
Yes, please.
So you've got this idea that IFS is an imaginal, dialogical, learning the language of the heart, and that is inevitably a spiritual practice in some way. How does that land for you?
It's hard for me to. Well, that absolutely lands. Just wanted to say it's hard to not view it like that. To me, it's really difficult actually to separate them.
I see.
But again, that's maybe a personal thing. I think there are ways where we can like really strictly look at it from a therapeutical perspective. But I think it's like there's way more potential to it, and I think in both senses, like we have to be responsible about this as well when we talk and when we bring it into connection with spirituality, because again, it opens up this whole pathway for spiritual bypassing, which to me is totally, again, akin to your question of self-deception within, in this case, within IFS.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
So
I'm concerned about that. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I could see if IFS isn't done on the path of the heart, it could very much be the pathway to spiritual bypassing in a very significant way. I do have a concern about that. And so but I think you've already given me a very good answer. So we're getting into the spirituality. And before we do that, I want to do evil.
Yes.
Which is, and this came up, not that the person can use IFS to engage in self-deception, to which you have given a very, beautiful answer.
Thank you.
I think a really beautiful answer. But this other question is, can the parts themselves be deceptive? Can they lie to us? Can they bullshit us? Can they manipulate us for their own survival, whatever that means, at our expense, right? And a lot of people are concerned. And of course, this concern comes up when those parts, like Hermes, for me, become archetypal and claim to be explicitly, transjective in nature and things like that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm thinking I'm thinking if I should share my experience first, because I had a similar archetypal experience regarding this question, and then
it's up to you. Like, do what you think. So, I mean, I don't want to expose you to expose yourself psychologically unnecessarily. But
no, I really thought about this,
if you think,
and I think it's okay to share it, because I think the truth is out. I mean, this phenomenology is out there, and maybe it's time to speak about these things. So I really thought about it, and it's okay. I mean, obviously, I'm making myself vulnerable to this, but I'm actually I try to follow your lead there. I mean, you spoke about your Hermes, and I think that was really courageous. And now I want to follow up on this. And so, John, when I thought about this question of self-deception, I really try to, again, and this is where IFS helped me, try to remember the credo of IFS, which is all parts are welcome.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so what ultimately helped me was actually this kind of approach in practice. So I treated self-deception as a living thing. Let's call it part for a second. I personified it imaginally as a living thing so that I can dialogue with it. And I can come into relationship with it. And it was really interesting because at first, John, I was able to grasp personal parts, like the subjective parts, that that apologize for their misdeeds because they were thinking about sinning and doing things wrong, and that was okay. And I was I sat with this part in a curious manner, and I welcomed them, and it was okay, and we could laugh about these stuff. But I was quite clear in this that I was saying, like, well, that's not what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for the personal biographical.
Mm-hmm.
You're tainted by self-deception. I'm trying to talk to self-deception.
Oh,
yes.
Wow. Just let me savor that for a minute. That is not only existentially brave, that's brilliant. Oh,
well, thank you. Well, I'm not lying about this. It was really an experience, and then it was interesting, John. then suddenly a force talked to me that didn't feel like a part, and it felt more
Oh,
archetypal, and it
yeah.
spoke to me, like at first it sounded a little bit more like an oracle, but it had this, it had this poetic language to it, and I really tried to make an effort to grasp it, understand it, and in IFS terms, you would say befriend it, right? I really tried to
Hmm.
befriend it and see and get curious about what it has to tell me, and to really understand its role and purpose. And then it spoke to me, John. It said to me, how can you realize the really real and significant things without me? How can you love and forgive without me? What can you love if not for the illusion? What can you forgive if not for the sin? How can you build responsibility without errors? Tell me, who will carry this burden if not me? And I was like,
Oh,
okay, what the hell? Yes.
yeah. The proper response.
Yes. And John, it was really interesting because this figure really, on the one hand, it talked to me with great might, power, and grace. At the
So was numinous for you, even?
Yes, yeah. And
Yeah.
and at the same time, it also it it had this sigh, this right? It also came from a place of exhaustion. It's part of it, I think it felt like the burden that this archetypal thing is carrying, but also from the ungratefulness that we have towards it.
I see.
So what I then realized in that moment, John, was that it's really a life force. Again, it's something that promotes life, and it's not something that deprives life. And I think, to me, that's the response to your question of evil. It's like this
So
whole
let,
in
let me,
being.
well, okay, let's just,
Yeah,
before
I'm
we get
sorry.
to the next step, there's one step right here. So, I mean, this is what came up for me. This is what came up for me is the very things that make us adaptive make us prone to self-deception.
Yeah.
And our deepest self-deception can actually disclose to us the depths of what it is that makes us adaptive.
Yes.
And without that self-knowledge, we can't actually properly
Yes.
flourish. How does that land for you?
That absolutely lands because, again, I think there is this deep ontological reality attached to it that I think we both propagate, or promote, and it's that reality is fundamentally relational, and
Yes. Yeah.
and this encounter with self-deception, let's call it
The spirit of
the spirit of
self-deception, maybe.
self-deception. Exactly, it's a spirit. Exactly.
Yeah.
It
Yes.
really, I it really made me realize that through self-deception and through, let's say, sinning, that we attain, first of all, consciousness, but also that we really learn to love, and that we learn humility, and that we learn forgiveness in this agapic sense. So it really made its point that, don't kid yourself. I am important, and there's no way around it. And then, John, it hit me. Then I thought about it. But I will give you a chance to comment on this. Sorry.
Well, no. First of all, I mean, there's a strain in Christian theology. I don't know if there's anything like it in Sufism, sort of about the idea of the benefit of the fall.
Yeah.
That if human beings didn't fall, they would have never achieved self-consciousness,
Yes.
and without achieving self-consciousness, they could not actually. They would have the image of God, but they could not come into the like. They could not be like God.
And is it
And,
similar to Milton's Lucifer kind of?
I'm not sure. I don't know if I'd say that, but it's more the idea that so they're very careful about this. The fall is a fall. It is an act of sin. But if that sin hadn't have happened, then human beings couldn't have lost their innocence. And without losing their innocence, they would have never become capable of being well, being properly godlike.
Yeah.
They had to be tempted by godhood in order to
Wow.
become godlike, if I can put it that way.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's good. That's really good. Yeah. Um, and
I mean, it's a powerful idea, and like many powerful ideas within the heart of a religious framework, it's deeply paradoxical because it sounds like the fall is necessary, which means God wanted it to happen, and then how could it be a sin?
yeah,
Because if God's making it like, and you get into all of these things, and I'm not going to comment on that because I can't and I don't know anybody who gets out of this, but this idea that we face this sort of primordial original sin, right?
yeah,
That actually launches us into the path of virtue in some profound way. And this is, although I don't know if it's in Milton, it's clearly in Blake.
yeah.
Blake has this idea running through his
Yes,
poetry.
yes, you're right. And I was thinking maybe it's not about solving this paradox. And this is also, again, something I learned from Jung, because some things need to be, we can't solve them. We have to outgrow them. And to me, self-deception that's exactly what I realized, that it's like, well, there's no way around it. We have to experience it. Maybe we even have to experience remorse so that we can practice forgiveness. So, and that to me was this deep realization. And again, I'm not, now we can get into more theoretical understandings of my experiences, and I'm not trying to equivocate or sound deep in any sense. What I'm trying to articulate is that if the deepest ontological reality is relational, and in this sense of aletheia in Heidegger's sense, right? It's a relationship between sufficiently differing aspects like the eidos, right? And themselves being relationships, and then we are again in this argument of this through line. Then in some cases even opposites, complete opposites. Then in order for relationship, and let's see how you think about this, John, in order for relationships to make sense, we need to validate the things that the relation binds, right? So they have to be real too. And to me, this is what I also understand with ratio religio. I hope that I understand it correctly, but what do you think about this?
I think so far I'm agreeing with you. Except I mean, and I've been doing this because I've gone through Filler's book in the course on ultimate reality, God and beyond, and I don't know if James thinks this or not. And I'm looking forward to talking to him about it. But you don't want to simply invert. What I mean by that is you don't want to say, well, it used to be the relata from which the relations emerge. And you don't want to say, no, it's the relations from which the relata emerge. That's just inverting. And all of the arguments that destroy the first position symmetrically destroy the second position. You want to say pure relationality is that which is below the relations and the relata, and from
too?
Yes, and from which but it's not a substance, right? Because it's pure relationality. It is that from which the relations and the relata co-emerge, and then that means it is like the spirit that is flowing through the emergence and the emanation, completely interpenetrating up and down. That's how I would.
Okay, that makes to me a lot of sense, and I don't think it's. I don't even see an argument against what I said, which is good, if I'm not mistaken, because I'm not arguing for the hierarchy. I think that absolutely you're right. It's below that, right? I was thinking, would you agree that the things that are bound and linked by the relation, that they also then necessarily have to be real and valid too? Would you agree with that?
Yes, and this is one of the issues I have. With sort of some notions of pure relationality, if you don't have any point where the relationality bends on itself, like the nous in relationship to the Neoplatonic one, then you just get this homogeneous, like the one of Parmenides, right, which is just this homogeneous sphere that is no different from nothingness. I agree. There has to be a. And this is where I think I have a lot of criticisms of Whitehead, but this is where Whitehead's idea that yes, it's like that, but the many become the one that adds to the many, right? And then goes back, and you got this sort of flowing accordion, holographic, fractal thing going on, rather than just this homogeneous blob thing going on.
Okay, that's wonderful, and
Well, I have something to ask you. Just hold your thought. Take a moment to get your thought. I don't want to jar it out of your head. But, I've been, and this comes from Nishida. I was thinking about, and Proclus's idea about the one within is the vehicle of the one without. And we were talking about the self last time,
Yes.
not as a thing or a substance, but more like a field of pure relationality. And I was thinking, maybe what can happen in IFS is you can move to the participation in that, which gives you a way of understanding by participating, knowing by coupling, knowing by participating, ultimate reality as pure relationality. It's not identical, but it is a deep realization by participation. What do you
That's
think of
wonderful.
that as a
I was
possibility?
actually thinking about exactly the same thing. That's the thought that I was holding. I was trying to bring in the self
Oh,
again,
wow.
because
Okay.
what you said makes sense to me. The context that you give or gave a second ago gives meaning to what Kierkegaard says with the self, right? It's the
Yeah.
self is
The
the
self is
relationship that relates itself to itself. In that
exactly.
sense, it really
Exactly.
makes sense that even this thing is the relationship that relates itself to itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
And
Yes.
and to me,
Exactly.
and now to answer the question of how we can deceive ourselves within IFS, I would say one of the fundamental mistakes people, I don't want to say mistakes because again, it's the language of training versus the language of explanation. So, but I still see problems with it, even in a practical sense. When there is this reification of the self, and they
Yeah. Yeah. It
they
becomes an
deal
idol.
with the self again as
Yeah.
something, as a part. And then what happens typically, John, is in IFS practices, people get into this push away kind of mentality, to push away a part to get to the self as if it's a thing. And I think that's
Oh.
this really, it's seductive, but in a bad sense. Like, it's really seductive to think like this, but I think that really is the self deception often going on in IFS.
Oh, that's brilliant. So the idea is that, like, if the self is this pure relationality that properly orients us towards reality because it participates in the grammar of reality, we can lose that by trying to turn the self back into a substance and then turning it into an idol. And then we get in totally the wrong, even though we're talking the word self, we get into totally the wrong framing.
Yes,
That is what is most crucial about the self, not what is framed, but the way you're participating in a fundamental framing.
exactly,
Is that?
absolutely.
Oh, that.
And
Okay.
and now again, talking about the traps and gaps of parts work, I think I have a problem with parts work when parts are used as a scapegoat for avoiding real
Yeah.
responsibility.
I brought that up, and that's a species of the spiritual
Yes,
bypassing kind of thing
exactly.
too. Where did I bring that up with Mark? I think I brought that up with Mark Lewis, and I said I can see people using that to divest themselves of their moral responsibility.
Yes,
Well, that wasn't me; that was this
exactly.
part.
That's
The,
exactly
the
what
old
they
joke of
say. Yeah,
yeah,
and I
it's the old joke of the devil made me do it kind of
yeah,
thing, and that
and I
kind of
think that
stuff.
is
Yeah, yeah,
deeply problematic because, by definition, that is something you want to address. Because when you say something like that, first of all, you cannot just dissociate apart from your own agency, right? I mean, you could, but that it would be either pathological, like in dissociative identity disorder and complex trauma, where this can happen, but then it's a pathology, right? Or it's really self-deception.
mm-hmm.
And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's
Yeah,
one of the points. So that's why I personally try to limit parts language to when I'm in situations of emotional upheaval and where I feel like my framing and my agency is hijacked by a part, in the sense that you talk about when you talk about parasitic processing,
yeah,
or when
yeah, yeah.
in Jungian theory you would say when you're gripped or possessed by a complex, right?
Complex. Yeah,
And then in IFS, you have the stepping back move that you do with your glasses too. We call it
yeah, yeah, yeah,
unblending, right? So you try to
yeah, yeah.
unblend from it.
Yep.
But there's also a problem in unblending, though, in my opinion. It's like, well, just as the stepping back move, can't account for everything, I still have to step back in, right? I have to
Yeah,
get into a part again, to me. And this is something that is often,
yeah.
I mean, I might be wrong, and people, with more experience in IFS might disagree with me, but that's okay. What I see often is that, well, I still have to act in the world, right? We are enacted beings, right? Our cognition is enacted, right? So my part still has to do the job.
Well, and to use the glasses metaphor, you have to put the glasses back on and look through the part and see if you can now see the world differently, because then something has changed.
Yes.
That's fundamental.
And to stick with the analogy, I would say when you take off your glass and you look at, smudges, and which is akin to the self-deception, and you try to wipe them away, you put them back on, you still have the same thing, but you have a different quality, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to me, this is what, to me, that describes what people talk about in IFS when you talk about being self-led, right? It's a quality. It's not a thing, right? There's just no thingness to it.
Yeah. It's a functional. We talked about this, that it probably has to do with these two Platonic things about, bringing about inner peace and bringing you into connectedness with reality, affording anagoge, affording agape. That's what it is. It's something like that.
Exactly. And to me, this captures better the idea of the self as this very process and product of optimal gripping and self-organization.
Yeah.
Right. So no self beyond self-organization. Or I think you compared it to the metaxu, and I think it's the inner logos then, when maybe it could be inner logos. I don't know.
I've recently discovered the work of William Desmond, and he built an entire impressive, profound ontology around metaxu. And I'm just diving very deeply into it. Deeply influenced by Plato. Really astonishing. And he's got the adjective. What is it? Metaxological. And he proposes it as that is what's sort of beyond the Hegelian dialectic. And so why did I say that? Because I think we're doing this. And I mean this in the right way. We're doing something like the theology of the metaxu here, and we're trying to bring it into a deeper, and we're arguing for a deeper and more proper apprehension and appreciation of what's going on in IFS.
Yes.
That's what I was trying to articulate.
John, can you put it's a book, right? The Metaxu one?
I recommend there's the William Desmond Reader.
Can you put it into the reading list also? I don't have anything to write it down.
Yeah.
Okay, that would be great. I would love to look into this. And if you allow, John, I just want to, circle back to my encounter with the spirit of self-deception.
Yeah.
Because we were talking.
I just wanted to note it was interesting that the spirit of self-deception spoke to you, sounds like, very truthfully, which was a really interesting sort of meta move. But keep going.
Well, yeah, that was also a feeling. I was thinking about this, if it's, maybe it was a trickster archetype, something like it, because you have it like low key and different kind of God.
Yeah. Totally.
Who knows if it was right? So, but we're talking about this, right? So we're trying to figure out these things together in a, collective intelligence here. And so you agreed that the thing that the relationship binds then necessarily also have to be true, right? So then I would say, if they
you said real before.
Sorry.
Yeah, real.
Real, exactly, real. And then I was thinking, if they are real, then I should attend to it.
Yes.
If they are real, I should attend to it. That's why I'll try to have a conversation with this.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Spirit.
Yeah.
And ultimately, my realization was that there is no reality without illusion, and illusion isn't necessary for reality, and vice versa, right? So, and they're relevant to each other.
Well, I mean, this is a Taoist move you're making, but it also goes to. I've just finished a course on the primacy of beauty that I've taught, and this idea that real is a comparative term.
Yes.
And illusion are and as comparatives they are bound. Something is only real in comparison to something less real, an illusion, and something is only an illusion in relation to something that's more real. And you can't just saying something like saying everything's an illusion is like saying everything is tall, but it would equally be wrong, if I'm hearing you right, to say everything is real, because that would be like saying everything is tall too.
It's the relationship. And what I'm trying to allude to again. And maybe again.
No, and Heidegger has that, by the way, right?
Yeah.
Heidegger has that being is both the unconcealment and the concealment at the same time. It's the shining forth, and it's always also the withdrawal into mystery.
Yeah, and this withdrawal, this shining forth and the withdrawal. I was thinking about this in a Jungian sense, interestingly enough, because understanding Jung, hopefully correctly, means that if things work into two directions, then it's not about the poles. I know that you talk about it's about the polarity, and I was thinking
it's about
maybe
the polarity.
Jung,
it's the force field. It's the force field, not the pole.
And I'm hearing Jung say, well, if they work into two directions, then the goal is the center.
Ah, right.
That's something I also associated with this, this deep wisdom by Heidegger. And again, maybe we can turn it into something practical also for the audience, so it doesn't stay as this kind of theoretical, intellectual thing.
Please.
And maybe from a therapeutic perspective, that to make things really real now, and so it also doesn't sound like a deepity. Okay. As you might know, and I'm sure you know, that there is a deep and persistent search for meaning in the state of trauma. People who are traumatized, have like PTSD, they really try to figure out what this beast is, right? They really ask about the meaning of this. And if I want to make sense and draw meaning and significance from my trauma, then maybe I can manage to understand my trauma as a force that wants to communicate something to me, as a messenger.
Mm-hmm.
And this is actually really something I do with my trauma patients then.
Oh, I see.
Well, I really try. It's by understanding that these events can potentially be relevant to your transformation, to your growth. By just framing this relationship like that, I can enter into a different kind and quality of relationship to my trauma.
Yeah.
And then in this relationship, and the quality of the relationship, lies the transcendence. And then patients and often clients can overcome that trauma, because again, in a hermeneutic style, they can make sense out of it. They can draw meaning out of it. And
Excellent.
It's exactly this reframing of the relationship that also can take away the power of the trauma and hand it back to the client and hand back the agency. So if you ask me, John, because that's to me ultimately what trauma is. I mean, it's a lot of things, but it's a displaced, I would say a displaced or disturbed, or maybe in your words, parasitic hermeneutic process. Right. So it's a loop, and it's not an event. The trauma is not an event, and it's also not in the event. It's in the relationship of me and the world, and how I make sense of myself and the world.
And it keeps
does that land with you? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I'm getting that this looping, it takes on a life of its own.
Yes.
And that's how it sucks agency away from the person that's traumatized.
Yes.
This is landing very well for me.
Yes.
Keep going, please.
Yes. And I think in very complex cases, again, that becomes difficult with IFS. To be really honest, I think then you really, really need a ecology of practices, not only IFS, but there is a way in IFS. IFS really found a way to address this being frozen in time in this loop, right? That's the unburdening process and going to the exiles, and it's this updating, right? It's this reframing, and again, it's I would call it a hermeneutic process, because you're trying to draw meaning of it and attend to it. And I would say from an agapic position, by attending to it from a place of love, so that again something opens up, so you can put the memory into the right kind of, I don't know what the right word is.
While it's ratio, it's the properly proportioning and prioritization of things in the correct perspective and from the correct participatory standpoint. It's deep logos.
Yes.
It's that proper proportioning that we expect from the reasonable person. That's what it is. It makes it reasonable. It doesn't mean they get all instantly happy, but now they are back in having a reasonable orientation that allows them to properly process this.
Yes.
Is that what I like when you're struggling for this language of proportion?
Yeah.
Because I've given up. Kasra, I've given up trying to get people to use the word rational to mean
Yes.
this broader notion other than logical. And so I'm saying, well, we have this other word. We use reasonable, and we don't mean logical.
Yeah.
We mean, like in the court of law, you have to do what the reasonable person would do. What does a reasonable person do? Well, they take the right perspective, so they prioritize the right things, they see things in the right proportion, and they participate as they properly should. And that's what I'm talking about.
Yes, and even from that perspective, even logic takes a different kind of meaning, because we can understand that it's deeply bound to the idea of logistics, right? To distributing our resources. So we have this optimal gripping again, and this harmony. I would think it's spot on when you said like this rational proportioning. That really that was the word I was struggling with to find. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's it's crazy.
So, I mean, I think you've given some like really, I mean this, beautiful answers. And I love, like, so, I love talking to everybody about this. I mean, I'm talking to, Seth Allison about this, and he's coming in with this deep reflection from the psychotherapeutic, which you have, of course, too. And then, and Mark, like you, has this deep psychotherapeutic perspective, but he also has this cognitive scientific thing that I share with him. Right. But now,
John, just to mention, my work on self-organized criticality intersects with Mark Lewis's work, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
So I know I briefly talked to him via mail, and because his lab in the Netherlands, I'm actually doing research with them. So that's interesting. There's not only an overlap in IFS in the therapeutic sense, but also even from the cognitive scientific perspective. So I just wanted to add that too.
No. I think that's good. And I mean, I think we should have at least one more conversation before we're sort of going to wrap up Voices with Vervaeke. But I'd like to have one more with you. And I don't want to completely lose the thread with everything we've been talking about, but I do want to have that conversation with you around your self-organizing criticality work and what the connections are between that. And
I would love that.
All this stuff. And I have a lot of connections between self-organizing criticality and the cognitive science I do. And you're totally right to mention Mark Lewis. So let's have you come back and do at least that. Because I don't want to, we're almost out of time. So I don't want to start that now. But I do want to do what I always do. First of all, I wanted to thank you. I was saying, you and you bring in the therapeutic and you have the cognitive scientific, but you also have the, like a deep philosophical, spiritual side of this that resonates very, very deeply with me. And I'm very appreciative of that. And so I just wanted to, I thank you. And thank you for being courageous about like opening up and making yourself vulnerable. Don't pay any attention to the horrible trolls that say stupid shit because you did that, because they'll do that no matter what you do. You just have to ignore them. But pay attention to a lot of people that are encouraged by you opening up and saying, we need to talk about this stuff because it happens, and it really happens, and it really transforms people. And we need to get the new language to talk about it correctly in order to deal with what's happening in the meaning crisis and the advent of the sacred. So I want to thank you. You participated and contributed to that very significantly.
Thank you, John. That really means a lot to me. And again, to be able to share this with you and to have a forum to speak about these things, for these things, but also together with you is, I think there is nothing that is more meaningful to me. And
Socrates says,
sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No.
I was going to say, Socrates says, participating in genuine dialogos is the best life that we can actually live.
I would 100% agree with this. And I just wanted to say to the trolls, I don't want to participate in hubris and to be too arrogant, but I'm not too afraid because I know that the proof is in the pudding. And I think I would speak with less confidence if I didn't see the merits and also the the success in the work that I'm doing with the students at
Yeah.
university, the
Yeah.
community that I'm in, but also with this, again, the severely impaired people that I work in on a daily basis.
You're
And to me,
doing
that
good.
is reassuring to, again, to
Yeah.
open, at least open the dialogue in this conversation. And, we both don't claim to have the answer, and it's still an
No,
ongoing
no,
dialogue,
no.
right? So, but at least let's, keep the ball rolling.
So the phrase is the proof is in the eating of the pudding, and you are deeply. You said some very delicious things here today, and I wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you, John.
I always like to give my my guests the last word, and it can be whatever kind of word you want: inspiration, summation, provocation, whatever you'd like to say.
I think it's not so much in my nature to, provoke people or, to say something provocative. I will say I would love to continue the series and to talk to you again. And also, again, to bring some of my colleagues and other thinkers like Robin Bear, just as an example, because we promised the audience last time that we want to talk about the AAA, like the archetype of the adolescent, and also ally
Right.
work.
Right.
And
Yes.
I just want to say, maybe we can keep it at that. I'm looking forward to this conversation soon.
Yeah, good. We'll make that one happen too. We'll make that one happen. I'm not going to stop having conversations. We're just putting Voices with Vervaeke into retirement. I will still have, individual conversations and
Wonderful.
dialogues. But uh, thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Really,
Thank you.
sincerely.
Yeah, I hope we get to meet in person someday. I think that would be really wonderful.
I hope that too. We will.